Welcome to IFAB Online, the first virtual conference dedicated entirely to fundraising across borders and organized by Chapel in York. My name is Magdalena Duleva, and it's my pleasure to present today our specialist session on creating an international fundraising action plan. A little bit about me. Over the last 17 years, I have been fortunate to partner with organizations in a number of countries, shaping and delivering major fundraising initiatives and securing transformational 6- and 7-figure gifts. I have both strategic and operational management experience, including designing and executing major campaigns, building and developing teams, and directing all aspects of the development and engagement operation. The majority of my roles have been as the chief fundraiser and working directly with the CEO, the president, the vice chancellor, the dean, and the main and fundraising boards, and have involved institutional capacity development, strategy development, resource allocation, and budget oversight. Some of the organizations I have worked with include University College Dublin in Ireland, Nottingham Trent University and Christian Aid in the UK, the International Union for Conservation of Nature in Switzerland, and Voluntary Service Overseas, or VSO, also in Ireland. What we will cover today. Perhaps you're a fundraiser who has been charged with securing funds from donors overseas, or you're a leader responsible for developing your organization's strategy for international fundraising. Regardless of your sector or your country, this session will provide an overview of the essential elements of successful fundraising across borders, including defining your audience, tailoring the case for support, recruiting and mobilizing volunteers, developing and prioritizing your prospect list, creating a schedule of engagement activity, and ensuring recognition and stewardship are never an afterthought. We're delighted that you're joining us for what's going to be a practical and focused presentation with relevant examples and case studies from a number of sectors and countries, and advice on how to adapt your plans to the reality of the current pandemic. We will also touch on some of the recent trends when it comes to developing the next generation of donors. If you're interested in a more in-depth discussion of some of the cultural or tax differences when it comes to fundraising across borders, I strongly recommend attending some of the region-focused sessions as part of the conference or Chapel in York specialist session on tax. And now moving on to the next slide, clarifying your objectives. Regardless of whether you're fundraising across borders already, it's essential to be clear on why you're doing it. There might be multiple reasons, but asking why will help you in a number of ways. It will help focus your efforts, ensure you're aligned strategically with the priorities of your organization, save money, and importantly, it will allow you to manage expectations. Many organizations find themselves having to start and stop or start and pause their international fundraising programs exactly because they failed to ask the big question at the start and failed to plan. This is not to say that you can plan for everything, that your plans have to be rigid and that you don't need to test the ground before you can determine the most viable course of action. But it does ensure that you can secure buy-in and commitment and budget for your program. Not just for the next trip and the next event, but ideally as part of a well-thought-through plan for the next several years. This will create continuity and will help establish trust with your overseas audiences. Overseas donors are often seen as a growth area, especially if your domestic market is already mature or if existing relationships have not been leveraged for giving. And increasingly, income is the top objective that prompts organizations to explore fundraising overseas. As I said, the reasons can be multiple. Fostering broader engagement and securing wide participation is another common reason. For example, a well-known business school with campuses in Europe and Asia is seeking 100% participation from their alumni in the latest giving campaign. That might not be during the same year, but they're confident this is achievable over the course of the campaign. This illustrates how the objective helps to shape the plan and the balance within your fundraising mix. If the main objective is, for example, absolute financial return, an approach that focuses on a smaller number of large gifts would be more appropriate than a campaign that engages a broader audience of donors contributing relatively small amounts. Again, the key takeaways here are know why you're doing it and have a plan. Okay, so you have initiated the discussion and clarified your organization's objectives when it comes to fundraising from overseas. This next slide will look at the essential elements of your plan that will help put your program on a solid foundation. In no particular order, these are: number one, a compelling case for support or the rationale as to why your organization merits support in the first place and why donors should care. Two, committed leaders, and that's both internally and externally. Number three, a large enough pool of prospective donors. Four, a plan to pull it all together, a plan of how to engage, brief, ask, and steward your international donors. And of course, five, the resources to execute the plan. Of the five, having leaders who are committed and engaged is, in my experience, the most important, as leaders can help you develop a compelling case, expand your circle of support, and secure the necessary budget. We will next look at some of these elements individually. The first element, the case for support. A quick reminder of what it is and why it's important. The case for support should describe your organization's work and answer the question, as I mentioned, why donors should care. It should also describe the impact of donor support, and it should be urgent and thought-provoking. The case can be communicated through one master document, for example, a brochure, and additional materials can be developed depending on your requirements. All this is very much in line with the fundamentals of fundraising. And for international donors, it should also spell out how your mission is relevant to them, how they fit into the overall plan, and why now, what makes your case urgent and compelling. On the next slide, we're looking at some of the reasons international donors give to causes overseas. With universities and schools, it's quite straightforward. Past students and pupils have an emotional connection to their institution and have a vested interest in seeing their alma mater thrive. Then we have organizations whose work spans the globe. For example, I worked with a globally distributed environmental organization who had never fundraised from the private sector before, and that wanted to establish a program, given that many of their competitors had been successful in generating support across a number of countries. Through a global consultation and a feasibility study, we helped them put together a global prospect list and involve these individuals, foundations, and companies in shaping what became the organization's first case for support. It focused on their unique contribution to the environment and conservation globally. They were best positioned to mobilize the global community to speak with one voice, to put collective pressure on governments, and to influence policy at the global level. Their first six-figure gift from a private individual was received within 6 months and reflected the strong relationship that their CEO had fostered with the donor, as well as the strategic and ambitious nature of the case for support. I wanted to mention as another example the outpouring of support towards the restoration of Notre Dame in Paris last year, and the solidarity shown by American donors in particular. As you will recall, the fire started on the 15th of April, and within days, hundreds of millions of dollars were pledged from all over the world. And while some of that is yet to materialize, as of August that same year, one organization, the French Heritage Society, had raised 2.4 million in donations, mostly from the US. Another charity, the American Friends of Notre Dame de Paris, established in 2017 to gather funds for the monument's restoration, reported that their donors increased from 800 who had donated 2 million before the fire to 10,000 donors who gave an additional 6 million, with 95% of the donations coming from the US. So what prompted this? Why were American donors so attached to a historic monument in another country? According to one academic who studies French history, a fascination for France has always existed in American culture, and Americans have a visual attachment to Notre Dame. To summarize, what does all this mean in terms of making the case to international donors? In adapting the case, you should be explicit about how your priorities relate to your international audience. Once you have developed your key messages, these should be tested externally. That's very important. It might not be realistic to have a formal feasibility study or a consultation, but you could test them with a small group of supporters who are close to you and refine the messages as needed. You should also be prepared to communicate your key messages consistently over time, so that they're top of mind and become embedded in your overall communications. We will next look at the second essential element of your plan, your leaders. Engaged and committed leaders are paramount to the success of your program. So what does that mean? Typically, fundraising overseas requires additional resources, so it's crucial to have internal support. We talked about the importance of having a plan. However, sometimes your organization's leaders would want to see results before committing additional resources, and you might find yourself in a chicken and egg situation. With any mass fundraising programs, one of the best strategies would be to try international fundraising as an extension of your domestic program, a small pilot that would demonstrate success and help make the case for additional budget. For example, a telephone campaign to your alumni in a particular country where, again, for example, your data quality is reasonably good. In a major gifts context, it would be important to manage expectation, particularly around the time it takes to build relationships with donors overseas, especially if you're able to see them, say, only once a year. Also, to communicate the risks involved with raising the expectations of donors and not being able to follow through. Next time, it would be that much harder and it would take that much longer to reestablish trust. With that in mind, I'd like to look at some of the best ways to engage leaders, both internally and externally. We know that people want to feel involved and to feel listened to, and in my experience, a very effective tool is to invite opinions both on the case of support and your plans overall. This would help secure buy-in and reposition fundraising and engagement more broadly as a shared pursuit, as opposed to just something that the fundraising office is doing in isolation. Depending on their comfort level, there are opportunities to involve leaders at every stage of the donor journey, from prospecting through to cultivation, briefing, asking, and stewardship. Again, in my experience, a colleague or volunteer might not be willing to participate in gift request meetings, but might be more than happy to thank existing donors and show their appreciation, for example, at an event. On the next slide, we will look at some of the considerations when deciding on the most appropriate way to organize and coordinate the efforts of your leaders. Depending on your context, you might be inheriting a structure, or you might have an opportunity to reshape that significantly, or you might be starting from scratch. We know that leaders do require support, and this is true both with domestic and international fundraising, and your structure should allow for that and serve to enable your program and not be an administrative burden. So how do you decide what works best? Let's say you're starting with a clean slate. Some of the key questions to ask yourself would include, is our fundraising going to be an ongoing or a time-limited effort? Do we know who our main audience segments are and how we can ensure they're all represented? Do we have a tradition of volunteer support on the ground, or is this something that we will need to introduce and actively recruit leaders? What role do we want them to play? Exclusively fundraising, fundraising and engagement, or engagement only? What level of support can we offer? Are we better off served by a formal group that convenes regularly and works towards a formal agenda, or is the ethos of our volunteers more informal and we will be able to accomplish just as much by having ad hoc conference calls and following up with members individually? I'm a big believer in looking at best practice from across the sector and adapting to our own situation. If you're, say, an arts organization, have a look at what your peers are doing. How have they organized their volunteers? Perhaps they have informal committees in a number of countries, a few committed champions, and an informal collection of individuals who are all passionate about your organization and your work. Or you might be an education institution and you have analyzed your alumni body and discovered that you have a critical mass of alumni in several key territories. I have been fortunate to work with a number of universities that have had formal fundraising committees whose members have reflected the diversity of their donor segments, including those based internationally, and have assumed responsibility for the financial success of the fundraising. What I have found is that employing campaign tactics could be very effective in sustaining both momentum and enthusiasm. In other words, introducing a financial goal and a timeline and adopting interim benchmarks to monitor progress along the way. This tends to focus attention and efforts as well as build confidence once some of your key milestones are achieved. One of the campaigns I ran at the business school used to call their fundraising committee the campaign cabinet, reinforcing the urgency of the campaign effort. At another university, the committee was called the Campaign Leadership Forum, again, reflective of the more consultative and less formal nature. They met less frequently, but this didn't affect the work with members individually between meetings, namely following up on the actions, planning for and debriefing from key meetings, and sending regular communications with updates both on the fundraising and other key institutional initiatives. A global organization where the campaign committee members were based all over the world, but managed to meet at least once a year in person at their HQ near Geneva and get together by conference call the rest of the time, were equally successful in terms of managing the activity of their volunteers. So hopefully this gives you enough food for thought and ideas when it comes to the structure and the organization of your volunteer leaders, especially those who are also leaders in giving. In my experience, meeting remotely can be just as productive if the meeting is chaired well and follow-up on actions takes place. So geographical distance or the coronavirus restrictions should not deter you from inviting leaders to serve in a volunteer capacity and help with fundraising. We will talk more about that later and cover some of the ways to keep your current and future supporters engaged while the world recovers from the pandemic. And now, a quick look at what makes leaders effective. And this is especially true for international fundraising, because when working internationally, you might be more dependent on the help of volunteers on the ground in the different countries. In my experience, the most effective leaders dedicate enough time to fundraising. They assume responsibility for the success of the effort. They help formulate and support the fundraising plan. They help identify potential donors, and they are willing to make a personal or influence the corporate or foundation gift. And they might also be willing to participate in the formulation of strategies and in select gift requests. How engaged your leaders are can be the difference between the success and failure of your effort. And one of the best uses of your time is time spent on developing a good working relationship with your leaders and managing their expectations. Equally, on the next slide, these are some of the ways that we as fundraisers are expected to support volunteer and internal leaders. For example, preparation for meetings, coordinating the logistics around events, drafting communications on their behalf, hosting conference calls, and assisting with technology. And more recently, colleagues in the sector have shared many examples of innovative practices and ways to maintain engagement during the pandemic. For instance, one organization invited prospects to a webinar where a volunteer leader spoke about the impact of the pandemic on their particular industry. It was very well received, and because it required a smaller time commitment, prospects who would otherwise be unavailable were actually able to attend. The webinar was chaired by the organization's chief executive, and that has given them an opportunity now to update their key contacts personally and pave the way for follow-up conversations. Other innovations I have come across recently include making it easy to send a personalized video message to a donor, either as a thank you or to invite them to an event. Universities in particular have benefited a lot from this particular product, reporting large increases in open rates and donor retention. Also, some organizations have used drone footage as part of presentations to prospects in order to make a capital project come to life at a time where physical visit was not possible. And the last example I wanted to mention is from the area of impact investing. We have seen impact investments perform well during the pandemic. There's a recognition among many investors that the global crisis requires a global response, and blended forms of finance, for example, philanthropy and impact investments, have become more popular. Now, this might not be applicable to your institution, but some leaders and donors might expect their beneficiary organizations to be taking advantage of such opportunities. And you should be prepared to explore this if it's appropriate for your organization. The current restrictions have also meant that in theory, we as fundraisers can connect virtually with more people because of the time saved not traveling. And now moving on to the next, or the third essential element of your fundraising plan, having a viable and a large enough pool of prospective donors. The first thing I wanted to highlight here is that there are significant differences in the approach to prospecting internationally due to the large differences between countries. This includes the quality of data, the level of transparency, and of course, cultural and tax differences. Geographical distance, as we know, is another barrier. Even universities who have large alumni bodies in a given country might struggle to engage effectively with alumni and identify more potential donors, as they might be spread across a large region. For example, when we were formulating the alumni engagement strategy at my last institution, we deliberately wanted to focus on key locations or cities as opposed to whole countries. We took into account the number of alumni in these cities and whether the cities are a current priority for recruitment, as this would also mean that members of other teams would be visiting and providing additional opportunities for engagement. More recently, with Brexit in the UK, many universities are also looking at strategic locations and partnerships in Europe in order to allow them to access research funding post-Brexit. To summarize, an effective strategy for prospecting internationally would also need to include engagement, and you shouldn't spread your efforts too thin, but instead focus on a few carefully chosen territories where there's a critical mass of potential supporters. You should be willing to test and constantly adjust your plans. This goes back to my earlier point about not being able to anticipate and plan for all eventualities, but being willing to pilot, test, adapt, and do more of what works. Another example from my last university, we were pleasantly surprised when an alumni event we held in Shanghai was oversubscribed because alumni flew in from other locations. What happened, of course, was that word of the event had spread via social media and many more alumni were reached in the process. Hopefully, in your role, you're able to benefit from the expertise of a prospect researcher or are able to commission prospect research from a vendor. But if not, it's helpful to have a starting point when trying to identify prospective donors. And this is what we will focus on with the next slide. There's a mantra in fundraising that your past donors are your best prospects. Well, this holds true for international fundraising as well. You should start by reviewing your previous and current supporters and friends. If you have a natural consistency, such as your alumni body, when looking to identify prospects in a particular country, you might want to review everyone in that territory. I have listed some other places you might want to look beyond your existing circles. Donors to similar causes and organizations, board members of charities with a similar mission, local companies whose business or social responsibility agenda is aligned with your mission or local work. You can start compiling a master list without prioritizing at this stage. And as you do this, it would also be helpful to make a note of who would be a potential volunteer leader as well as a potential donor. We will next look at some of the ways to start rating and refining your list. A natural place to start is by talking to your colleagues, volunteers, and existing donors and asking them to think about who else might be interested in learning more about your organization and whether they would be happy to make an introduction. Depending on your relationship, you could also ask them to provide additional information such as which projects or initiatives might be of interest to their contacts and the size of gift they might be willing to contemplate. Now, this is an ideal scenario, and it's worth mentioning that in many countries, peer screening, for example, might not be culturally acceptable. So the softer version where you talk about contacts versus prospects, an invitation versus an approach, involvement versus giving or fundraising would be more likely to get people to open up. Secondly, I wanted to touch on wealth screening. While prospect research looks more in depth into particular prospective donors among individuals, companies, and foundations, wealth screening is most helpful when you have a large set of data that you're looking to segment and prioritize. It is not an exact science, and it's worth knowing what the ratings are based on. Increasingly, wealth screening is available in different countries, either combined with prospect research or as a standalone service. As part of your fundraising action plan, you would need to ensure that any service you undertake is compliant with the data protection and other regulation in that country. If in doubt, seek professional advice either from your in-house team or from outside counsel. They would be able to advise whether the service you're considering is compliant and whether it is covered by your existing legal notices as an organization. For example, in the UK, the introduction of the EU-wide GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, in 2008 caused a lot of confusion for charities and nonprofits about what is and isn't allowed, and most organizations stopped wealth screening completely. Whereas now, 2 years on, providers had adapted to offer services that are GDPR compliant, and fundraisers are better able to advocate internally about the importance of wealth screening and ensure that their organization's privacy notices are transparent and explicit about all their practices concerning the personal data of prospects and donors. As a general advice, if you have the resources and can commission a service that is compliant with the relevant local regulation, wealth screening can be very useful in enabling you to segment meaningfully your prospective donor list and tailor and focus your efforts where they're likely to bring the highest return on investment. We talked about meaningful segmentation. Now, what do we mean by that? Typically, you would want to be able to rate and prioritize your list by a number of criteria. This varies from institution to institution, but the things to look for are: number one, affinity, or how close someone is to your organization; two, capacity, the size of the gift they would be capable of making; and three, their readiness, how knowledgeable and well-briefed they are about your organization and your needs, and where they are on the journey to be ready to be asked. Also, do they have everything they need to be able to make an informed decision following the ask? Affinity and readiness might look similar, but there is a subtle difference in that affinity relates to their relationship and level of engagement with the organization as a whole, whereas readiness relates specifically to the level of engagement with the gift conversation. Have you ever talked to them about your needs? Do you know about their giving interests? And are they willing to have or continue the conversation about their own giving? Every organization uses a different system for prospect management and different ratings, but what I have found useful is to adopt a very simple rating system using the 3 criteria above and using a very simple DCBA approach when it comes to the readiness. With D, develop, being the rating for someone who is just the name on a list. They don't know much about you and you don't know much about them. C stands for cultivate and describes the next step. This is someone who requires further engagement before you can talk to them about priorities, needs, and giving, perhaps inviting them to an event as a next step. B stands for brief. The next step is to brief them on the priorities, learn more about them, and gauge their interest in being involved and in giving. And finally, A, indicating that they're ready to be asked, having been briefed on what is required and having indicated their interest and potential level of giving. The last thing I wanted to mention on ratings was that even if you're unable to assign specific target gift request amounts to everyone from the start, it's helpful to put prospects in bands or ranges. In other words, are they a 5-figure, a low or high 6-figure, a 7-figure, etc. prospect, which should be sufficient at this stage for the segmentation and prioritization. And of course, as fundraisers, we know that we should always prioritize warmer prospects, and those we can get to call the prospects who might have higher capacity. Now that you have developed a sufficiently large prospect list, it's essential to keep in regular contact with your international prospects and donors, and you should strive for at least 4 communications within a 12-month period. The role of communications in the context of international fundraising is, as we know, to educate and cultivate prospects, to motivate volunteers to support and drive your effort, and to steward the relationship with donors. Some of the communication tools you might want to consider, and that's in addition to a well-managed social media presence with engaging content, would include a digital news update for volunteers, donors, and prospects. This could be sent every quarter as an email containing links to major stories and news items. It could also include a cover note from an organizational leader. Also, a progress report for members of the core leadership group that could be shared more frequently, or a 2 to 3 minute video featuring testimonials from key leaders, donors, or beneficiaries. The video would be targeted at prospective donors, played at events, and expanded and improved as new donors come on board and the fundraising starts hitting its benchmarks. Once the core leadership group is established, a web presence for the fundraising effort, especially in relation to donor recognition, would also be very helpful. And another option would be to provide online access to a lecture or a webinar series that gives opportunities to communicate key messages and interact with prospects. In addition, in terms of internal communication, it's helpful to have an internal fact sheet for staff explaining the aims and ambitions of your fundraising in that country, and a regular briefing, again, for staff within and beyond your fundraising office, which will also provide opportunities to brief them regarding their role in the fundraising. All update meetings in the context of communications could be held via a conference call. I will now move on to the next essential element of your international fundraising plan, a well thought through schedule of activity. And I want to focus on events in particular. In the context of your international fundraising, events are opportunities to reach out to potential donors, tell them about your work and plans, and bring them closer to your organization. This initial contact should be followed by one-on-one meetings with those attendees who are interested. We know that each interaction with a prospective donor is a two-way street and offers a chance to inspire them to get involved further. We know that the prospect is ready to be asked when they have been sufficiently briefed about your priorities and fundraising plans and have indicated an interest in continuing the conversation or even invited a proposal. With regards to the format of cultivation events, drinks receptions and breakfast meetings for between 8 and 12 people are well received by prospects, and they are a very effective cultivation tool. A dinner hosted by a leader is another option. However, worth considering is that receptions and breakfast meetings allow for a more focused and business-like discussion. We will next look at some examples of how organizations have adapted to the current pandemic. Of course, COVID-19 has presented significant challenges to the sector, but what's encouraging is that many organizations are successfully running alternative versions of their regular events. We're recording this in mid-October, and over the last 3 to 4 months, things have really started to pick up in terms of organizations being innovative and inventive when it comes to transforming their usual event activities. I mentioned earlier an example of an organization that reinvented their cultivation event for major donors in the form of a webinar for a small group of people, which was hosted by the CEO, and where one of their volunteer leaders gave a briefing on how the pandemic is impacting their sector. It was very well received. And the particularly encouraging thing about that event was that prospects who ordinarily have no or very little availability were able to join. What also worked well was that this online briefing allowed the CEO to follow up individually and continue the conversation with those who attended. I wanted to mention a few examples of special events as well, in addition to cultivation events. I know that this would be relevant to many organizations that hold special events abroad for their overseas prospects and donors. For example, over the summer, 2 cultural organizations in the States, a museum and a ballet, held virtual versions of their annual galas and were able to create online experiences that were artistic and elegant, that inspired giving, and that cost less than their traditional events. Some of the common features included varied and well-paced content to hold the attention of viewers, a mix of both recorded and live segments, a pre-event VIP virtual cocktail reception, recreating the food and drink experience by sending food and drink to guests in advance, and a recording being made available to attendees for about 2 weeks afterwards. Some of the other elements of these events, these recreated galas, included creating a new donor society in the weeks leading up to the event for one of the organizations that raised $800,000 at a cost of about 5%. The other organization utilized volunteers to chair the gala who were very media aware and tech savvy and who had large followings on social media and were able to generate significant support through their text and pledge campaign. Both of the organizations were very creative in their use of vendors and platforms as well. One used an app which served as the equivalent of the event book, where sponsors could advertise and guests could connect with one another using the chat functionality. And crucially, colleagues reported how guests were energized and excited to be part of something that is new and original. Other recent examples that come to mind, special events, bear mention in the context of international fundraising, as well as domestic fundraising, include the Virgin London Marathon this year and UNICEF UK's Soccer Aid. This year, the annual Virgin London Marathon took place in October instead of April, as you probably know. More than 36,000 participants braved the rain to complete the first ever virtual event, which was also the largest of its kind in the world. While the elite races were taking place on a closed-loop biosecure course in St. James's Park in London, people from 109 countries had 24 hours to complete their own socially distanced race, many raising funds from charity. The event raised 16 million, which was well below the record-breaking 66 million last year, but still an example of how adapting quickly and reinventing your event could put you in a better position than simply deciding to stop all programs. In contrast, UNICEF UK's Soccer Aid event did very well. It is a televised friendly style football match between 2 teams, England and the rest of the world, composed of celebrities and former professional players representing their countries. The event raised a record 9 million this year compared to last year's 6 million, a big part of which was due to a very generous matching challenge. To sum up, when it comes to special events during the pandemic, resist the urge to automatically cancel, as there is a lot to learn from emerging best practice in the sector worldwide, which is bound to be useful in reinventing your own events program. And now that we covered the separate elements, a quick note on pulling it all together. Ultimately, donors, international or otherwise, give to the change they want to see in the world, and they give to our organization's ability to deliver. This is worth keeping in mind when adapting your case for support. I also wanted to say a few words about donor recognition and stewardship. When it comes to overseas donors, this should be proportionate and in line with your typical recognition levels and planned well in advance. For example, your institution's leaders should know that securing large gifts from international donors would typically mean committing to and making themselves available for annual visits and regular updates with the donor. And while many of the principles covered today apply mostly to major gifts, the fundamentals are also applicable to your regular giving efforts and other parts of the fundraising mix. No international fundraising action plan would be complete without a discussion on the importance of policies and due diligence. We know that when you're working with donors overseas, it is even more important to have robust policies and protocols in place and to do your diligence before accepting a gift. And in conclusion, I cannot overstate the importance of leaders. I was thinking about some of the most successful international gift requests I have worked on, and the key factor in securing these seven-figure gifts was, by far, the quality of the relationship the president, the dean, or the chief executive was able to develop with the overseas prospects, the strength of their vision, and the personal attention they afforded these individuals. And of course, let's not forget that on a more practical level, having your internal leaders buy in to your international fundraising plan would help you secure resources, make sure that it's appropriately resourced, and that in turn will help establish continuity and avoid having to stop and start. One of the questions I get asked often is how to engage and how to identify in the first place the next generation of donors. Where will our future donors come from? And I thought it would be useful if we spent a few minutes looking at some of the trends when it comes to younger donors, millennials, Gen Z, and Generation X, who are poised to inherit from their parents, baby boomers. Looking specifically at millennials and Gen Z, we're seeing that technology and innovation continue to be key to fundraising and that the share of digital marketing will continue to increase. We also know that millennials' appetite for giving is connected to social consciousness and that they have a preference for a transaction-based exchange. Over the last few years, we have seen the emergence of platforms that award users points for contributing to a campaign, both through creative content and a financial donation. In other words, a reward for doing good. Giving, therefore, needs to be made simple, fun, and rewarding to engage these audiences. Activism is also on the rise, as well as the profit with purpose mindset among young entrepreneurs. And on the next slide, I wanted to cover the main trends when it comes to next generation high net worth philanthropy in particular. A report by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors estimated that millennial donors are now worth $235 billion globally. We can see some pronounced differences in preferences and behaviors as compared to previous generations. For example, an increased awareness about social inequality, different priorities for giving, with more millennials giving to the environment and fewer to culture. And the main motivations being to give back to society and influence social change. At the same time, the next generation of high net worth philanthropists tend to focus on fewer causes, but have much deeper involvement. And they tend to bring problem solving and disruptiveness to their donation strategies. And finally, on to our last section for a recap on adapting your plan to the current pandemic. Although we've touched on this throughout today's session, I thought it would be good to summarize in one place the impact COVID-19 is having on organizations and how to adapt your international fundraising while the world is preparing for an economic recovery. What we know from previous crises and recessions is that they tend to be uneven, with many industries and individual donors thriving alongside those that are struggling. What this means for our organizations is that we should, while remaining sensitive, give all our prospects the opportunity to stay involved and give. A recent article in the New York Times reported on notable increases in philanthropy to certain types of organizations since the start of the pandemic. According to a report by Fidelity Charitable, for example, donors to donor-advised funds gave $3.4 billion since the start of the pandemic, an increase of 28% on last year. Grants to food banks and other food assistance programs were up 667%. In addition, 32 community foundations reported an 80% increase in donations to 203 million from March to May compared to the same period last year. At this point, data from the rest of the world is sparse, but anecdotally, we're seeing examples of generosity worldwide. As of July this year, WealthX reported that nearly 11% of the billionaires participating in their global 2020 billionaire census have pledged to coronavirus relief efforts, with billionaires from the technology sector giving the most to relief efforts by far. Many organizations are moving ahead with gift requests that were already planned and finding innovative ways to engage new prospects. We talked about small virtual gatherings, following up individually, and inviting new and existing contacts to help reshape plans and programs as a way of involving them. Ultimately, we should see the current restrictions as an opportunity. We also talked about how some organizations have reinvented their event programs and are now able to run events at a lower cost, resulting in higher net income. Also, many studies over the years have told us that the main reason donors stop giving is because they feel disconnected from the organization and they don't know what's going on, as opposed to not being able to afford to give. This brings us to the end of today's presentation, and I wanted to thank you for attending this virtual session. I hope you found it useful and that you will be able to apply some of the principles in your own programs soon. I would encourage you to keep reaching out to colleagues in the sector and learning from their experience. And last but not least, please remember to take care of yourself and your team in these challenging times. Once again, thank you, and I wish you every success with your international fundraising.